Hello and welcome to our fourth episode of the Wagner Students for Criminal Justice Reform podcast. I'm your host, Thurston Powers, and with me today is our chairwoman, Sheba Rivera. So, a lot happened in the world of criminal justice over the past 2 weeks. There was progress on some issues, losses on others, and the future, quite honestly, just looks strange.
Interesting word to use.
Yes, yeah. I believed the polling going in, and I believed the media. I thought, well, time to just sort of buckle up and accept what's happening. And I mean, I wasn't looking forward to either of these candidates, but I was surprised. I thought that the polling data would be a lot more accurate than it turned out to be.
Yeah, as we got closer, though, some of the polls were certainly tipping. I was seeing a lot of Trump +1. It's just that a lot of sites like 538, which I loved so much until now, were also taking into account previous polls. So everything was weighted. So just because all of the polls in the last week were saying Trump +1, they were still taking into account polls that had been 2-3 weeks before that.
And a lot of the political science models predicted a Trump victory. But, I mean, it's sort of like the Brexit thing where we think that, well, people in the Midwest can't be that angry, right? They were, and, it's justified.
And for me, I think I have to consider a lot of people who feel disenfranchised at this moment and a lot of people who are disenfranchised. So, for instance, people who can't vote because they have a felony conviction and they're in a state that says anyone with a felony conviction either can't vote or can't vote for a certain amount of time. And a lot of states, even if you have a misdemeanor and you're in jail, you can't vote. Other states, I really don't expect them to go around to their jails and start handing out ballots, even though legally people who are detained have the right to vote. So we're talking 8 million people right there. In Florida, that's 10% of all of the eligible voters cannot vote because their right to vote has been taken away. And predominantly people who've been marginalized already.
That's true. One of the things that I thought was interesting, though, was the way in which a lot of people who voted for Obama in 2008 voted for Trump in 2016, especially people who were blue-collar union workers. I think Jon Stewart pointed out that, like, they weren't so racist that they were unwilling to vote for Obama in 2008. So it's strange to call them, practically like Klan members or deplorable or whatever they got cast as in 2016. I think that the middle of the country is experiencing disenfranchisement. I think that it is showing. I mean, there's different kinds of disenfranchisement, obviously. But I think that they're dealing with very high suicide rates, very high rates of opiate addiction and joblessness. And that is something that needs to be addressed.
I agree. And I think that a lot of people don't know where to turn and who to blame. And I'd say that it's easy to play onto the fear of the Hispanic person who's taking your job, even if there are no Hispanic people in your town. It's easy to say that when really it may be globalization, could be urbanization, it could be how coal just is not the industry it used to be. And to play off of that fear, I think is problematic just in terms of the relations of this country. So while I think it's hard to say anyone is racist, the idea of
not
voting
if you're on CNN. Apparently, it's very easy if you're on CNN.
Well, I mean, the practice, I mean, the practice of voting because of an illegitimate fear, um, that is a racial motivation, that is inaccurate. So that's something that I think should be talked about, and how easy it might have been to turn people, uh, is an issue. I understand it's campaigning, but this has repercussions for the country, um, and we all have to live together in this country. So I think you have to be a little bit, um, you have to show up as a leader and not try to use that rhetoric.
I sort of look at the NAFTA argument not from. I don't think it had so much to do with racism as much as it had to do with, and I don't know their minds, but I can tell that there was a serious economic concern. I mean, the idea that NAFTA destroyed jobs or that it took jobs away or took more jobs away than it created just isn't borne out by the numbers. I mean, if NAFTA had been passed in 1954, maybe you could argue that that destroyed the manufacturing sector. Because that's when the downward trend started, and it was just constant from that point on. So,
Mhm.
and for viewers, NAFTA was passed in I think 94, and so this has been something that's been happening for 60 years, uh, and so yeah, no, it was not about NAFTA, but that sort of economic populism, that sort of like nationalist, collectivistic, like we need to view ourselves as a team, as a group fighting against other countries for wealth, is very sort of, I don't know, it reminds me a little bit of Lenin.
Mhm.
um,
Right. And another thing that people don't talk about, I think there's so much this focus on, um, what people who voted, people who changed their vote. There's a lot of people who also did not vote,
yeah,
who
I
couldn't
mean,
bring themselves to vote for Hillary or Trump because they felt like nothing ever worked for them before. And a lot of those were also, people of color that said, "Well, I voted for Obama, and you know, they're still shooting black people." And so, I don't feel an urge to vote for anyone. I feel like change needs to happen in another way. So I don't think that, I think that the focus should be on a lot of different things that are happening in this country. Our economic position is one, but there's also something that, people of color have been talking about for a long time, and that is, criminal justice reform, and making some changes to people in the community. Many of those people who can't vote now.
yeah,
So yeah.
but that is important for midterm elections, though. I mean, a lot of the criminal justice reform stuff that needs to happen can only happen at the state and municipal level. So if people want to get involved and make change, midterm elections are when their vote counts the most because that's when turnout is the lowest.
Yeah, well, I feel like there's going to need to be some motivating of voters. They would need to understand how their vote matters in this
Down ballot.
proposition or that proposition, um, especially when they've seen much more happens when they organize,
Hmm.
and when they throw a rally, there might be an actual change in how their community looks at policing. Um, so I think a lot of people are looking at it in a different way, and they don't see voting as the answer anymore.
Just unfortunate because voting is the only kind of revolution that happens without, I don't know. Usually, most revolutions involve bloodshed. Voting is a way of making that nonviolent.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm not as afraid of the organizing and the activism, but I can, you
People
know.
were saying people have to die. I mean, have you seen that video yet?
I was in Argentina this summer, and they have. I should put some context to this. There's something known as the piqueteros in Latin America that when there was an economic crisis, they put rocks in the middle of the road. They would throw rocks on the road so that the economy had to grind to a halt, because the idea was, if we can't be a part of your economy, we'll shut it down. And when I was in Argentina, someone told me, they're never going to listen to you in the United States until you start throwing some rocks.
Hmm.
And so, and that's how they saw change happening, not by voting, but in 3 weeks, they unseated 5 presidents. That's where they saw change happening, and now that's something that continues to have. That's how people are politically motivated, and I think change happens in many different ways, um, but sometimes it happens on the ground too.
And yet, we saw the percentage of the population living in a state where smoking marijuana is legal increase from 5% to 20% overnight.
Mm.
So I'm just pro voting. That's where I am. But I mean, there are certainly consequences to the election that are not great. Going into the election, there was some thought that a that Republicans were going to be unseated, and that a lame duck session would result in federal sentencing reform. That is not going to happen anymore. So it's unfortunate, but as we just said, that most of the problems in the criminal justice system are actually state and local. So one positive thing that I've noticed coming out of the Republican supermajority is that I am now hearing Democrats argue for state powers and municipal power and fighting the federal government, which is just music to my ears. I mean, a few weeks ago that would have been considered racist, but now it's patriotic. I mean, what are your thoughts on the change in dialogue on sort of state and municipal power?
I wish this was something that I'd watched more before, but I think that my faith in federal government, if there was any, certainly was much lost by watching how stalemated the Obama administration was. So you just this last Congress, or the last few Congresses, are known as do nothing Congresses, where um, they're trying to stop any change, or stop any legislation. That is their motivation. So yeah, I'm all for it. I think change needs to happen, and if that's the only way, um, and if that's a way where communities can really have their voices heard, which I think is the most important thing, then yeah, I'm excited. See it.
I will say this about the do nothing Congresses. When Congress does agree, it's usually that they've found a way to make things worse. So I actually prefer do nothing Congresses. That might just be me. I don't know. I don't see a lot of people agreeing with me on that one, but I do like them.
Well, maybe we just don't need them. Is this your first? Is how you would amend the Constitution, or?
Well, if I were to amend, quote unquote, amend the Constitution, it would be to limit executive power. Ever since FDR, we have just had one president after another president sort of pushing the boundary of what the executive branch can do. And, the Cato podcast put it this way, like, Donald Trump is the thought experiment a libertarian would pose to a progressive. Like, would you really support, like, for example, like Obama bombed 7 countries in his presidency, really without any permission from Congress. Would you really support giving Donald Trump the power to bomb 7 countries without talking to Congress first?
Right. Hmm.
So I would I would really cut back the power of the executive branch. I would probably get rid of their ability to regulate, just have them focus on sort of executing the laws passed by Congress. Um, and I would probably strengthen sort of like the sort of the war powers and sort of force the executive branch to have to get permission in relatively short order before bombing people. Like,
Mhm.
um, but yeah,
Yeah, I agree. I do think that some things have fortunately happened just with Obama signing something, and I'm so grateful. And I'm sorry that my only issue is now a lot of them are going to be undone. Um, again, with a simple signature. So it's it also doesn't create um, any permanent change.
yeah. But for our purposes, the
Prison,
majority, yes,
private prison,
prisons. Oh, wow. Well,
more
you know,
private prisons, for better or worse. Probably a lot worse.
you know, I will say this. The way we have set up private prisons is just absolute pure corporatism. If we had a system where there was like competitive bidding and people could had more choice and they didn't have to, for example, there weren't these occupancy rules where you had to like make sure that the private prison was at 95% occupancy before you were allowed to send people to your state-run prison. Like that's like the opposite of what privatization is supposed to do. You're supposed in a privatization, you're supposed to make the private company work hard for your tax dollars. You're not supposed to just give them as much money as you can and continue to hire them for like 10 years at a time. These contracts are ridiculous.
Hmm.
Um,
And I think that you pay for performance. So,
yeah.
I'm actually drawing up a model now, and maybe who knows, in 20 years they'll be used somewhere. I think that they should show a reduced recidivism for what they do, and we
Mm.
know it's possible. Finland's got some amazing prisons, if you even want to call them that. They're basically like cities where people have a key, but they have no recidivism. They've got like 1%. That's what we could make here if we want to say that. The corporate sector is the private sector would be so much better at running prisons, then make them work for it, make them
Yeah.
show some benefit, let them be providing education, treating citizens, treating people in prison with respect, so that when they leave prison they become a part of our society, which is ultimately our goal, and not that they come back. One, I talked to someone who used to work at Vera Institute yesterday, and she suggested that maybe if they recidivate, if they go back to prison, the prison has to take them back for free. How would
Yeah.
they react then? How much would they work to say maybe some people don't even have to go to prison, because we know that this could be something that's more detrimental for their process, and perhaps an intermediate punishment is better.
Yeah, I completely agree that there needs to, one, be competition, and two, we need to actually be paying them for doing a good job. Um, right now, it is just corporate welfare. It is a government handout program. It is awful. And so the private prison thing, it's just like if we're going back to sort of the problem we have like right now, well, I guess it never really went away. But if we're going back to sort of the system where we're handing out 10-year contracts without any sort of metric of success, then that's not really privatization.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, that's just terrible. But if it's here, then I think we should look at ways to improve it.
Yep.
So there were a lot of ballot measures, and I don't have them right in front of me, but one of the things I noticed was that state legislators are terrified of getting criminal justice reform on their record, because what if it backfires? And instead, they've been doing a lot of ballot measures. And it wasn't just marijuana, although that did get a lot of headlines, but there was a lot of sentencing reform. And Nebraska banned civil asset forfeiture, which is something I've been looking into.
That's exciting.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, civil asset forfeiture was initially put into place to combat pirates back when we funded our federal government through tariffs, import tariffs. So to get around taxes, pirates could bring in goods, and the Navy could stop them and seize their goods in order to reduce tax evasion. That has somehow turned into basically police officers being able to take your money, your car, your house, if you seem suspicious. It's some states have some levels of proof that are nicer rather. Connecticut has a pretty high level of pretty high burden of proof. Other states do not. And this is one of the big issues with for-profit policing, where you've got police departments that are basically funding themselves as they get their budgets cut from sort of their municipal government. They're funding themselves through civil asset forfeiture and other things like tickets, fines, what have you. And yeah, it's just, you have a right to property. You should not have that violated ever. Like unless you actually commit a crime and you get convicted, and at that point you've entered like a state of war and they're allowed to do what they want. And that case, there's criminal asset forfeiture. We already have that. That's already in place. So why do we really need civil asset forfeiture?
Right. We're incentivizing the police to not be working for us, but using their authority to oppress us.
Yeah, or to pay their own paychecks, which is not police, almost all of them are great people, and they're just doing the job that they've been told to do by these politicians who have written these insane laws criminalizing all sorts of behaviors. And then you're telling them like, well, your budget got slashed and we need to fund the town government, so go set up a speed trap. I don't think that any police officer, I'm sure there's like a bad apple every now and then, but I think most police officers probably do not enjoy being basically tasked as the tax collector for a town. That's not their job. That's not fair to put them in the position of. But yeah.
Right. And that's, like I'm saying, we're creating a system where they benefit by creating an us and them mentality.
Yeah.
And that's really not helpful for anyone. It's not helpful for relationships that the community and the police need to keep up. And, we already know it's a thankless job. So for them to know this, have this sort of culture where this is how they are compensated for such a thankless job, I think is going to create, a cycle of something that, to us, to civilians, feels like oppression, and to them feels like business as usual.
So one of the things I saw on the Foundation for Economic Education in response to, what's his name, Castile, the police officer who shot the concealed carry guy in a traffic stop. The guy was pulled over and he did the exact right thing. And he said, I've got concealed carry permit and I've got a gun in the car. Just want to let you know. And, he got shot and died. And that strikes everyone as wrong. Like, that should not happen. And that feeling we have is sort of this internal compass of like what is right, what is a just law. And I particularly like Bastiat's perspective, which is sort of this idea of sort of like there are individual rights from natural law, and government is limited in what rights it has to the rights of individuals acting collectively. So, like, I can't steal your stuff, therefore the government should not be able to steal your stuff. I can't murder you, therefore the government shouldn't be able to murder you. And it relates a lot to the we were talking earlier about the death penalty. There was a couple states that voted on it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, a couple states voted to keep it. Oklahoma and Nebraska.
Yeah.
I think California, last I looked, was too close to call. I'm not sure where they decided to go.
Yeah. So from my perspective, the state does not have the right to basically execute someone. As an individual, you have the right to defend yourself and to use lethal force in your defense if it's justified. So that's what gives the state the right to defend itself from other countries, to defend itself from, bandits and what have you, and, actually use lethal force in defense. But if I were to detain someone or incapacitate them, I don't have the right to then kill them. Like, if they're no longer a threat to me, then that's just murder. If the state has detained an individual, then they're no longer a threat if they're in prison. And therefore, the state does not have the right to then kill that person. That's just murder.
Yeah, I'm looking at California now. I think they voted the same. They voted to keep the death penalty.
Yeah.
And it is a time when fear is winning. And people work by how they feel. I actually was in a conversation last week with administrators at NYU, because I'm in another group that is trying to abolish the box that asks about criminal history on our undergraduate application. And what they've done, and after our years of organizing for this, having SUNY actually take the box off of their application, they have changed it to ask only about violent crime. And their reasoning behind this is, well, we got together and we just decided that would make us feel safer. And they have the data. They know if someone formerly incarcerated is committing more crimes on campus. They know that that's not true, but they're not looking at the research. That's specifically what they told us, that it's not about the research, it's about how we feel. And I think that's what we see across the board. And I think that's why dog whistle politics is so popular still. This idea of like, how do you feel about these type of people? Like, would this make you feel better? And no one's actually looking at the data and what would make us more safe, more efficient, restore our communities.
Yeah, I mean, that perfectly relates to the call for national stop and frisk and the expansion of sort of broken windows policing. The data we have suggests that aggressive policing may have accounted for 10% maybe of the drop in crime. But the cost is massive, not only in terms of municipal spending on police, but also you really erode sort of the feeling of trust in the community, and you can very quickly make the community feel fragmented. And I mean, and I'm talking about community from like sort of the jurisdictional perspective, like like a town. And I understand that the definition of community is a bit more complicated than that. But from this perspective of policing, I mean, it's a little bit hard to, I think. Well, what's your take on that? So, sort of the idea that there are many different kinds of communities and overlapping in all sorts of different ways.
Right. I think
How do you police each of those, quote unquote, like differently, or is that even right to have different laws and different, well, not different laws, but different standards of policing?
well, we know how we look at things in Wagner. We look at the numbers, we look at the
Yeah,
statistics, and how that's done is we look at neighborhoods, because that's how this data has been collected. If you look at stop and frisk, primarily certain neighborhoods have been targeted, and those are not just Black neighborhoods. Those are specifically neighborhoods that have a higher amount of what some would call native Black people. So neighborhoods that are more uh, people who have immigrated to the United States do not have as much stop and frisk. So it definitely has been. You see that certain neighborhoods have been more targeted, and they also have not seen, like we know with stop and frisk, that being more targeted has resulted in more things being found. So it
yeah.
is just
The efficacy has like an inverse relationship with how many stops you do.
right. They they are targeting these neighborhoods. There are definitely whole neighborhoods. If we're just looking at, say, this district in Bed-Stuy or this district in Bushwick, like those neighborhoods are they have been found to be more targeted, and that creates an animosity between that neighborhood and the police. And they do not see the police as someone they want to call when there's a crime. They don't see them as working together, and that does have an effect then on, say, how that person feels if they change neighborhoods. So that feeling can stick with people, even if they go to an area that's less targeted, or where the police are trying to change in, how they police, and that can affect our communities across the United States.
But people can feel that seeing people doing like foot patrols makes them safer, even if statistically, even if we know that it doesn't actually make them safer, they feel safer. And I think that that's sort of like the reaction, kind of like, we have seen a lot of terrorist attacks. We have seen a rise in some cities in terms of like gun violence. But that's just 1 year. We don't know what next year is going to be like.
And I
Like
think
it could just be a blip.
it depends on who you are, if that makes you feel safer. I mean, I'm someone who
Yeah.
has um, been targeted by the police, and I'm someone who has experienced what I would say is improper police conduct, and I don't necessarily feel safer if I see a police officer. I'm sorry, I wish it was different, but that's not what makes me feel safe. If I see people in my community running around, if I see a playground where kids are laughing and playing, that makes me feel safe. I don't think, oh, here's a police officer, I feel more safe. I might actually wonder a little bit, well, why are the police here? And do they have a motive or an agenda? What's happening? A lot of things go through my brain, but safety for me is not one of them.
I think that it is interesting that the places that have been most exposed to sort of broken windows, aggressive policing, that those areas are the areas that voted heavily blue. I mean, now obviously there's other reasons for that. I don't think anyone went to the polls and was just like, I'm going to vote against stop and frisk by voting against Trump, because I've lived in New York and I've experienced stop and frisk. But I did not hear, I didn't hear anyone on the left really adopting pro stop and frisk who was sort of representing urban constituents. And I realize I mean urban as in like the actual city constituents, not African American in particular. I know that sometimes, according to CNN, that can be, coded language. Good God.
Yeah, I mean, I think de Blasio said some interesting things in response to Trump saying that we needed more stop and frisk. And a lot of what was reported is just that he told Trump, mind your business. You don't know anything about policing and why we have reduced stop and frisk. But if you look more closely, he pointed out reduced. And he does think that the right amount of stop and frisk, along with the right amount of precision policing, solves all of our problems. I don't think that's the answer, and I don't think that it's looking at data, because data has a lot of bias, especially neighborhood bias, that's baked into it. And so yeah, I think that the headlines have said that, but I think more work needs to be done on how we look at policing.
I can't get over the fact that so many city mayors and state politicians are saying, like, we're gonna fight the federal government. Oh man, they're I mean, geez, Gadsden flags are just gonna be everywhere in New York soon.
I mean, this is what you were waiting for, I guess. Every cloud has a silver lining.
Yeah, I mean, the another thing I've seen is that, like, the anti-war Democrats have finally come out of hibernation. They've been hibernating for 8 years.
Exactly. Where were they? I mean, Obama was bombing a lot of nations, and where were they then?
Yeah. So it's gonna be an interesting 4 to 8 years, I think.
Oh, why did you have to say that? Well, I just say to all of the people, I was talking to a friend today who voted for Trump, and and they believe, well, he doesn't really mean all those things he said. I just say to them, if something starts happening where marginalized people are targeted, that's your president, and we expect you to say something, and you need to be on the watch. If you're saying, you are being given all of this agency, well, that also means that you have to recognize your responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, I joke about this, but if you were concerned about your neighbor being taken to an internment camp, form a local militia. Just
Yeah.
I mean, maybe they'll just think like twice, be like, maybe it's not worth it. Be a porcupine. Be a porcupine. But yeah, so I think that the next year, I think that if there is going to be a movement on criminal justice reform, I think it's going to be at the state and local level. And I think that some of the alliances that are going to have to be formed to do that, now that a lot of state governments have switched Republican, are going to be interesting. But I think it's possible. I think that there's I don't think that this is going to stop. I think that the economic situation and the individual liberty situation, I think that there's going to be just strong pushback against. Hopefully we can now address like the NSA and the Patriot Act, That'd be great, right?
Yeah,
I know.
well, my worry is that he wants to keep open Guantanamo Bay and fill it with, well, who knows who. So
Um, it,
I think we all need to watch out for ourselves because there could be a lot more, political prisoners than we would expect. Um, so
well, fingers crossed, and we will be focusing on state and local, trying to push criminal justice reform, and a lot of uh, the problems with the federal government it its prison population and its interactions with the population in terms of criminal justice are luckily limited. So we, at the state and local level, still have a ton of power. And one thing we've learned from sort of the legalization of marijuana is that like the federal government is slow, and it's usually the last to know that change is coming. And there are cases where states and local governments can just sort of choose not to enforce federal laws. I mean, obviously that's not always the case, but in some cases there are. Um, but yeah, I don't know.
that's a good
Hopefully,
point. We are resilient.
yes. I think that is a great note to sort of finish on, which is that everyone here, everyone listening, you're resilient. You can get involved. You can start now. You can start working towards getting voter turnout for the midterm elections and try to just sort of get people moving on criminal justice reform.
Mm-hmm. Or throw some rocks in the road.
I am not endorsing that. Thank you so much for joining me, Sheba.
Yes. Thank you for inviting me.
And thank you for listening. If you enjoyed what you heard, please subscribe. Good night.
Good night.